I'm Peter Austin, that is Edward Mordake, and this is Interesting. Or is it? Is it Edward Mordake, I mean, not is it interesting? You see, for starters, there's a great deal of disagreement about how this man's name is even spelled. Most references insist on using Mordrake with an R, particularly modern articles, but if you consult the original source material, you will find that it was definitely Mordake to begin with. More to the point though, is this photo actually of Mordake himself? Was he even a real person? Those of you who already know the main beats of Mordake's case might have it filed away in your brain as a simple urban legend of ambiguous origin, but what if I told you that the story can actually be traced back to 2 qualified doctors and the Royal Scientific Society? Sure sounds compelling, doesn't it? Well, let's find out as we look at the case of Edward Mordake, the man with 2 faces. Given the kind of content I make for this channel, I don't think you'll find it that hard to believe that at school, my friends and I spent a lot of our lunchtimes in the library, and one book we particularly liked leafing through over and over again was a massive hardback collection of unsolved mysteries and historical curiosities. This is where I first learned the story of Edward Mordake. The facts presented there were very much the same as those you'll see in most reproductions of the story on the internet today. Edward Mordake was apparently the heir to an English peerage in the 19th century, but unfortunately was born with an extra face on the back of his head. A woman's face that surgeons determined could not be safely removed without killing Mordake in the process. The face seemed to have a life of its own and relished in tormenting poor Edward. Reportedly, it would scowl when he was happy and laugh whenever he cried. This photo, the most famous of Edward, was included in the book, and as you might imagine, the whole thing certainly ignited our imaginations as school kids. But in time, of course, I did develop a few critical thinking skills and learned not to take these sorts of books at face value, no pun intended, and so I soon put Edward into the back of my mind. That one was intended. But years later, I was listening to this for the very first time, a Tom Waits album by the name of Alice. It's a brilliantly weird and unnerving musical experience from start to finish, absolutely true to form for Waits, but one song in particular caught my attention. The intensely mournful track 6, Poor Edward, was all about Mordake, and I was kind of surprised at how suddenly the story came flooding back to me after so many years. Did you hear the news about Edward, sings Waits. On the back of his head, he had another face. The face could laugh and cry. It was his devil twin. At night she spoke to him of things heard only in hell. Oh, chilling. There was nothing for it. I had to find out where the story originally came from. Was Edward real? Well, I didn't have to dig too deeply to find one of the major sources, actually. It seems that though the tale does go back a little further, and we'll come to that in a moment, it was first popularised when it appeared in Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine, an 1896 book of unusual medical cases compiled by qualified doctors George M. Gold and Walter L. Pyle. And if you'll forgive me, I'd rather like to read some parts of the Mordake section for you verbatim. One of the weirdest as well as the most melancholy stories of human deformity is that of Edward Mordake, said to have been heir to one of the noblest peerages in England. But upon the back of his head was another face, that of a beautiful girl, lovely as a dream, hideous as a devil. It would be seen to smile and sneer while Mordake was weeping. The eyes would follow the movements of the spectator, and the lips would gibber without ceasing. No voice was audible, but Mordake avers that he was kept from his rest at night by the hateful whispers of his devil twin, as he called it, which never sleeps, but talks to me forever of such things as they only speak of in hell. For some unforgiven wickedness of my forefathers, I am knit to this fiend, for a fiend it surely is. Such were the words of the hapless Mordake to Manvers and Treadwell, his physicians. In spite of careful watching, he managed to procure poison, whereof he died, leaving a letter requesting that the demon face might be destroyed before his burial, lest it continue its dreadful whisperings in my grave. This is like a work of horror fiction, so what are we to make of its inclusion in Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine? Well, firstly, I should of course point out that it is entirely possible for a person to be born with quote-unquote two faces, but only really as a result of a few extremely rare types of conjoined twinning. However, all conjoined twins are necessarily monozygotic, i.e. identical, so it doesn't ring true that Edward's second face could be that of a beautiful woman. Perhaps you won't be surprised to learn then that while this book does indeed feature a great many 100% bona fide medical cases that we have other corroborating records of, there are also plenty of completely fanciful ones. So that begs the question, where did Dr. Gold and Dr. Pyle find this story for inclusion in their book? Well, as seen on hoaxes.org, we do actually have the original source for the entire Edward Mordake phenomenon. On December the 8th, 1895, the Boston Sunday Post published this article by writer Charles Lowtin Hildreth with the very sympathetic title, "The Wonders of Modern Science, Some Half-Human Monsters Once Thought to be of the Devil's Brood," and amongst the descriptions he provides of several different so-called monsters, we find an identical write-up of the Mordake case. It's literally word for word. Gold and Pyle plagiarised him, actually. One difference, though, is that it also includes a sketch of Edward with his second face just barely visible on the back of his head. Now, it is quite compelling at first glance to note that Hildreth himself claims to have found this story and the others in his article amongst reports made by the Royal Scientific Society. Okay. The only problem is, no such organisation has ever existed. There is, of course, the UK's National Academy of Sciences, simply called the Royal Society, but this doesn't help us, because the Royal Society has a very complete archive and it does not contain any material relating to Edward Mordake or any of the other individuals mentioned by Hildreth, such as the Fish Woman of Lincoln, whose legs were not only perfectly fused, but also covered in scales so as to resemble a fish's tail, or the Norfolk Spider, a man who crawled around on 6 hairy legs. Not 8, apparently. In such fantastical company as this, it becomes quite clear that Edward Mordake's story was not that of a genuine medical case of parasitic twinning. Rather, Hildreth, who was also known for writing speculative fiction, invented the whole thing for the Boston Sunday Post and simply presented it as fact in order to pull in the readers. But what about this photo? Well, apocryphal or not, Edward Mordake has understandably garnered a lot of attention over the past 100 years or so, resulting in several museums commissioning waxworks of the legendary figure. This photo seems to be of one such model from the Panopticum in Hamburg, or if not, a very similar statue from elsewhere. So there you have it. While there are a couple of very rare medical conditions that could give rise to an apparently double-faced person, this story, and the photo that so often circulates with it, is simply an elaborate work of fiction. And it's just as well, to be honest. If it were all true, I don't know if I could cope with Tom Waits's interpretation of Edward's untimely end. He begins his final couplet with, "Some still believe he was freed from her," but then suggests that perhaps the demon face deliberately drove Edward to that act which Christianity considers an unforgivable sin, and took poor Edward to hell. Another of the happy endings you've come to expect from this channel. I've been Peter Austin, and that was interesting.